What if the person you trusted most had been living a lie all along? This isn't just betrayal. It's a web of secrets so shocking it destroyed an entire family. And the twist? It all started with one daughter's discovery. Before we dive into this gripping story, make sure to hit that subscribe button so you never miss another true crime tale, and let us know in the comments, what would you do if you uncovered a betrayal this big? Now, let's get started. Emily always thought her family was the picture of happiness. Her parents, Sarah and James, had been married for over 30 years, and from the outside, their life seemed perfect. Sarah was a devoted mother and wife, spending her days running the household and making sure everyone was cared for. James was a respected businessman in the community, known for his charming personality and generosity. Together, they seemed like the kind of couple who had weathered every storm life threw at them and came out stronger. But Emily started noticing things that didn't add up. They weren't obvious at first, small moments that felt out of place. Her father started working late more often, claiming his business was busier than ever. Sometimes his phone would buzz at odd hours, and he would quickly glance at it and put it away. Emily tried to ignore these signs, convincing herself that she was overthinking. After all, her parents had always been a team, and James had never given anyone a reason to doubt his loyalty to Sarah. One day, as Emily sat in the living room scrolling through her phone, her father's phone buzzed on the coffee table. He wasn't in the room, and the screen lit up, revealing a message that immediately caught her attention. It read, "I miss you so much. Can't wait to see you again tonight." Emily froze, staring at the words. Her heart pounded in her chest as a mix of emotions washed over her, confusion, disbelief, and anger. Who was sending her father messages like this? And more importantly, why? At first, she hesitated to look further. This was her father, after all. She didn't want to invade his privacy, and part of her was afraid of what she might find. But something about the message felt too serious to ignore. With trembling hands, she unlocked the phone and scrolled through the conversation. Her eyes widened as she read through weeks of romantic messages exchanged between her father and someone named Laura. The messages were full of flirty words, private jokes, and plans for secret meetings. Emily's stomach churned. This couldn't be real. How could the man who had always been a loving father and a loyal husband be hiding something like this? She put the phone down and sat in silence, trying to process what she had just discovered. Her mind raced with questions. Was this just a phase, a mistake her father had made? Or was it something bigger, something that could destroy her family? Emily didn't know what to do. She couldn't tell her mother, not yet. Sarah adored James and had always trusted him completely. Emily knew this truth would crush her. But how could she pretend everything was fine when her world had just been turned upside down? Her heart ached as she tried to make sense of it all. For the first time in her life, Emily felt like she was carrying a secret too heavy to bear. And deep down, she knew this was only the beginning of a much darker truth waiting to unfold. Emily couldn't sleep that night. She lay in bed, replaying everything she had just read on her father's phone. Every smile, every family dinner, every kind word James had ever said to her mother now felt tainted. The messages she found weren't just casual. They revealed an entire second life her father had been living, filled with secret meetings and promises to another woman. As she stared at the ceiling, Emily's thoughts drifted to all the moments that now felt like red flags she had ignored. She remembered how James had become more distant over the past year. He started spending more time out of the house, blaming it on business meetings or long days at work. Sarah never questioned him, always trusting that he was doing his best for the family. But now, Emily realized there had been cracks in their life that she hadn't wanted to see. Her father's late-night phone calls, his sudden trips out of town, and the way he seemed distracted even during family moments, it was all starting to make sense. The next morning, Emily tried to act normal. She joined Sarah at the breakfast table, where her mother was cheerfully humming as she poured tea. James wasn't home, claiming he had left early for an urgent meeting. Emily found herself watching her mother closely, wondering how Sarah could be so calm and happy when her husband was betraying her behind her back. She felt an overwhelming sense of guilt, knowing something that her mother didn't, something that could change her life forever. Throughout the day, Emily couldn't shake the feeling that she needed to know more. She couldn't just confront her father yet, not without understanding the full extent of his betrayal. If he was lying to Sarah about one thing, what else could he be hiding? She decided to pay closer attention to his behavior and started noticing even more unsettling details. James would come home late at night, always with a rehearsed excuse. His phone was constantly locked, and he would get irritated if anyone touched it. He had also been spending money more recklessly, designer watches, expensive dinners that didn't match their typical family lifestyle. Emily knew her mother wouldn't notice these things because Sarah wasn't the type to ask questions or pry. She trusted her husband completely, and James had always used that trust to his advantage. Emily felt torn. Part of her wanted to protect her mother from the painful truth, but another part of her couldn't stand by and let this continue. She started keeping a notebook, writing down every suspicious moment, every unexplained absence, every piece of evidence that confirmed her father's double life. It was during one of these moments that Emily realized she couldn't do this alone. The secret was consuming her, and she needed a plan. But what could she do? She couldn't destroy her family on a hunch or a handful of text messages. Yet, the more she uncovered, the more she realized her father wasn't just cheating. He was building a lie that was far bigger than she had imagined. As the days went by, Emily's anger grew. She wasn't just angry at James for betraying Sarah. She was angry at herself for not noticing sooner. All the signs had been there, staring her in the face. She had trusted her father, just like her mother had, and now that trust was shattered. But this wasn't just about anger or betrayal anymore. Deep down, Emily knew she had no choice but to uncover the whole truth, no matter where it led. Something inside her told her this was just the beginning, and what she was about to discover would shake her family to its core. Emily's determination to uncover the truth deepened with each passing day. Her father's excuses and the growing list of suspicious behaviors only solidified her belief that there was more to this betrayal than just an affair. She began piecing together a timeline, trying to figure out when this all started. How long had he been lying? Months? Years? The thought made her stomach churn. One evening, James returned home unusually late. His clothes smelled faintly of perfume, and there was a nervous energy about him as he avoided eye contact with Sarah. Emily sat silently at the kitchen table, watching him like a hawk. He casually mentioned another long day at work, but his voice lacked conviction. Sarah, as always, smiled warmly and didn't press him further. Emily clenched her fists under the table. How could he stand there and lie so effortlessly? That night, when everyone had gone to bed, Emily crept into the living room where her father had left his briefcase. Her heart raced as she opened it, careful not to make a sound. Inside, she found neatly organized files, business contracts, invoices, but tucked between them was something that didn't belong. A small, elegantly wrapped box. She opened it to find a gold bracelet with the inscription, "Forever, L." Emily's breath caught in her throat. This wasn't for Sarah. Her mother hadn't received jewelry like this in years. L had to be Laura, the woman from the messages. Anger boiled inside her as she snapped the box shut and placed it back where she found it. She had all the confirmation she needed, but still, she wanted answers. The next day, she decided to follow James. He had told Sarah he'd be attending a client lunch, but Emily wasn't convinced. She waited until he left the house, grabbed her car keys, and trailed him at a safe distance. Her heart pounded as she navigated the streets, careful not to lose him. James eventually pulled into a small cafe on the other side of town. Emily parked her car and watched as a woman emerged from inside. Laura was younger than Emily had imagined, probably in her mid-30s, with a polished appearance and a confident air about her. James greeted her warmly, his face lighting up in a way Emily hadn't seen in years. The sight felt like a punch to the gut. She watched as they sat together, laughing and leaning in close. The intimacy between them was undeniable. Emily gripped the steering wheel, her mind racing. She wanted to storm into the cafe and confront them both, but she knew this wasn't the time. She snapped a few photos with her phone, feeling both guilty and justified. "This isn't spying," she told herself. "This is protecting my family." As James and Laura left the cafe, Emily stayed hidden. She watched as they hugged in the parking lot, his hand lingering on her waist before they went their separate ways. It was a betrayal she couldn't unsee, a memory that would haunt her forever. On the drive home, Emily's thoughts were a chaotic swirl of anger, sadness, and confusion. She had the proof now, the texts, the bracelet, the photos, but what could she do with it? Confronting her father alone wouldn't be enough. The lies he had built were deeper than she'd imagined, and she feared there was still more she didn't know. For Emily, this wasn't just about exposing an affair anymore. It was about protecting her mother from a life of deceit and uncovering the full scope of her father's betrayal. She realized there was no turning back now. She had started down a dark path, and the only way forward was to find out everything. What she didn't know was that the worst was yet to come. Emily sat on her bed that night, staring at the photos she had taken of her father and Laura at the cafe. The images burned into her mind, fueling a storm of emotions she could no longer contain. She had kept her silence for too long, but now the weight of the truth was crushing her. The lies, the secrecy, the betrayal, it was too much. She needed answers, and there was only one person who could give them. The house was quiet as Emily made her way downstairs. She found her father in his study, sipping whiskey and scrolling through his phone, completely unaware of what was coming. She stood in the doorway for a moment, her heart pounding in her chest. "This is it," she thought. "No more hiding." "Dad," she said, her voice trembling but firm. James looked up, startled. "Emily, what are you doing up this late?" She stepped into the room, her eyes locked on him. "I need to talk to you," she said, her tone sharp. "And I need you to tell me the truth." James frowned, setting his glass down. "What are you talking about?" Emily pulled out her phone and held it up, showing him the photos. "This," she said, her voice cracking. "I know, Dad. I know everything." For a moment, James froze, his face a mix of shock and guilt. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. Emily took a step closer, her anger spilling over. "How could you do this to us?" she demanded. "To Mum? To me? Do you even care about this family at all?" James sighed heavily and leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples. "Emily, it's not what you think," he said, his voice low. "Oh, really?" she shot back, her voice rising. "Because what it looks like is you've been lying to Mum and sneaking around with another woman. So please, Dad, enlighten me. What exactly am I supposed to think?" James looked away, avoiding her gaze. "It's complicated," he muttered. "No," Emily said, her voice cold. "It's not complicated. You cheated, you lied, and now you're sitting here acting like it's no big deal." James finally met her eyes, and for the first time, Emily saw a flicker of shame. "I never meant for you to find out like this," he said. "Find out what?" Emily snapped. That you've been sneaking around behind Mum's back. That you've been living a double life while she's at home, trusting you completely. Do you even understand what you've done?" James sighed again, running a hand through his hair. "Emily, you don't understand." "Then explain it to me," she yelled, her voice cracking with emotion. "Make me understand why you would throw away everything we have for someone like her." James didn't answer right away. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet. "I didn't plan for this to happen," he said. "It just happened. Laura and we connected in a way your mother and I haven't in years." Emily stared at him, disgusted. "That's your excuse. You connected. What about Mum? What about the 30 years she's spent loving you, supporting you, building a life with you? Does that mean nothing to you?" "It's not that simple," James said, his voice rising slightly. "Your mother and things haven't been the same for a long time. I didn't want to hurt her, but I needed something more." Emily felt like she had been slapped. "Something more," she repeated, her voice trembling. "You needed something more, so you decided to destroy our family. Do you even hear yourself right now?" James didn't answer. He just sat there, staring at the floor, as if he couldn't face the damage he had caused. Emily felt tears stinging her eyes, but she refused to cry in front of him. She turned to leave, her voice shaking with anger. "You don't deserve her," she said quietly, "and you don't deserve my respect." As she walked out of the study, Emily felt a mix of anger, sadness, and relief. She had confronted her father, but it didn't feel like enough. The truth was out, but the damage was far from repaired. And deep down, she knew this was only the beginning of the battle to come. The confrontation with James left Emily shaken, but it also gave her a sense of clarity. She knew she couldn't keep this secret from her mother any longer. Sarah deserved to know the truth, no matter how painful it might be. That evening, Emily sat across from her mother at the kitchen table, nervously stirring her tea as she tried to find the right words. Sarah, oblivious to the storm brewing, smiled warmly and asked, "Is something on your mind, sweetheart?" Emily's throat tightened. She didn't want to hurt her mother, but the thought of Sarah continuing to live in ignorance felt unbearable. Finally, she took a deep breath and said, "Mum, there's something I need to tell you. It's about Dad." The smile faded from Sarah's face, replaced by a look of concern. "What is it?" she asked softly. Emily hesitated, tears welling up in her eyes. No, I know he's been seeing someone else." She reached for her phone and showed Sarah the photos she had taken, along with the text messages she had found. Her hands trembled as she pushed the phone across the table. "I'm so sorry, Mum. I didn't want to believe it, but it's true." Sarah stared at the images, her face unreadable. For a long moment she said nothing, and Emily began to panic. "Mum, are you okay? Please say something." When Sarah finally spoke, her voice was calm, but there was a deep sadness in her tone. "I always knew something was wrong," she said quietly. I didn't want to believe it." Emily's heart broke as she watched her mother's composure crack. Sarah looked down at her hands, her lips trembling. "I thought maybe I wasn't enough anymore," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I thought if I just loved him harder, supported him more, he would come back to me." "Mum, no," Emily said firmly, reaching across the table to hold her mother's hand. "This isn't your fault. None of this is your fault." Tears spilled down Sarah's cheeks as she nodded, her grip tightening around Emily's hand. "I don't know what to do," she admitted. "How do you rebuild a life when everything you thought you knew is a lie?" Emily felt a surge of protectiveness. "We'll figure it out," she promised. "You're not alone in this." But as comforting as her words sounded, Emily knew the road ahead would be anything but easy. In the days that followed, Sarah tried to hold herself together for Emily's sake, but the cracks in her composure were impossible to hide. Meanwhile, Emily couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to her father's betrayal than just the affair. She began looking into his financial records, driven by a suspicion she couldn't fully explain. What she found was worse than anything she had imagined. Late one night, while James was asleep and Sarah was quietly reading in her room, Emily sat at the dining table, sifting through his bank statements. At first, everything seemed normal: regular expenses, grocery bills, and the occasional restaurant charge. But then she noticed a series of large withdrawals and transfers to an unknown account. The amounts were significant, enough to raise serious questions. Emily's pulse quickened as she dug deeper, cross-referencing the dates with the timeline of James's meetings with Laura. The pieces began to fall into place. Her father wasn't just having an affair, he was funneling money out of the family's accounts to support Laura's lavish lifestyle. Designer handbags, luxury spa trips, and even a down payment for a flat in her name were all listed in the transactions. Emily felt a wave of nausea as the truth hit her. James hadn't just betrayed Sarah emotionally, he had put their financial stability at risk. Every penny he had spent on Laura was money taken from the home Sarah had worked so hard to build. It wasn't just infidelity, it was theft, wrapped in deceit. The next morning, Emily confronted him again, this time armed with evidence. She slammed the bank statements down on the dining table as James sat with his morning coffee. "Care to explain this?" she asked, her voice cold and sharp. James's face drained of color. He picked up the papers and scanned them, his hands trembling. "Emily, I can explain," he stammered. "No!" she snapped. "You can't. You took money from this family to support your little secret life with her. Do you have any idea what you've done? Mum trusted you. We both did." James tried to justify his actions, claiming he never meant to hurt anyone and that he had always planned to make things right. But Emily wasn't having it. "You didn't just betray Mum," she said, her voice shaking with anger. "You've destroyed everything we built as a family. Do you even care?" James lowered his head, silent and ashamed. For the first time, Emily felt like she was seeing the real man behind the facade, the one who had torn their family apart, piece by piece. As Emily stormed out of the room, she felt a strange mixture of victory and despair. She had exposed the truth, but the damage had already been done. The man she had once admired was gone, replaced by someone she could barely recognize. And now, she and Sarah had to figure out how to pick up the pieces of a life shattered by lies. The days after Emily revealed the financial betrayal were some of the hardest Sarah had ever faced. She moved through the house like a ghost, her face pale and her eyes swollen from nights spent crying. Yet, beneath the surface, there was something stirring, a quiet strength that Emily hadn't seen before. Sarah had spent her entire marriage trusting James, supporting him, and putting his needs before her own. She had believed that loyalty was the foundation of their family, but now that foundation had crumbled. And as painful as it was to face the truth, Sarah began to realize that she had been living in denial for years. One evening, Sarah called Emily into the living room. Her voice was calm, but there was a determination in her tone that caught Emily off guard. "I need to tell you something," Sarah said, sitting down on the edge of the couch. Emily sat beside her, worried about what her mother might say. "What is it, Mum?" Sarah took a deep breath. "I think, deep down, I always knew your father was capable of this," she admitted. "There were signs over the years, moments when I felt like he was drifting away. But I ignored them because I wanted to believe that he loved me enough to stay loyal. I didn't want to face the possibility that the life we built was a lie." Emily listened, her heart aching for her mother. "Mum, this isn't your fault," she said gently. "You didn't deserve any of this." Sarah nodded slowly. I know, she said. And that's why I've decided I'm not going to let this destroy me. I've spent my whole life putting him first, but not anymore. I'm going to fight for what's left of my dignity, for my future, and for yours too. Emily felt a surge of pride as she looked at her mother. Despite the heartbreak, Sarah was finding a way to stand tall. It wasn't just about surviving the betrayal anymore. It was about reclaiming her life. Just as Sarah and Emily began to discuss their next steps, another twist turned their world upside down. While sorting through old paperwork in the study, Emily came across a folder buried at the bottom of a drawer. It was marked "Personal," and something about it felt off. She hesitated for a moment before opening it, and what she found left her speechless. Inside were documents that revealed James had been involved in shady financial dealings for years. There were receipts for off-the-books investments, contracts signed under false names, and evidence of accounts hidden overseas. It wasn't just about Laura anymore. James had been living a double life in more ways than one. Emily rushed to show the folder to Sarah, who sat in stunned silence as she flipped through the pages. He's not just a cheater, Emily said, her voice shaking. He's a criminal. Sarah's face hardened as she read the documents. It wasn't just the betrayal of their marriage. It was the realization that James had jeopardized their entire future for his selfish gain. We have to confront him about this, she said firmly, but this time we're not going to let him talk his way out of it. That evening, Sarah and Emily sat across from James at the dining table, the folder placed in front of him like a ticking bomb. Sarah's voice was cold and steady as she spoke. We need to talk about this, she said, sliding the folder toward him. James's face went pale as he opened it, his hands trembling. For the first time, the confident facade he had always worn cracked, revealing the fear underneath. Where did you find this? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper. That doesn't matter, Sarah replied. What matters is that you've been lying to us for far longer than we thought. This isn't just about an affair, James. You've put our family at risk, financially, emotionally, and legally. Do you have any idea what you've done? James tried to explain, stammering about bad decisions and getting in over his head, but Sarah wasn't interested in his excuses. You've destroyed everything, she said, her voice breaking, and I'm done letting you drag me down with you. Emily watched as her mother stood up, her eyes blazing with a strength she had never seen before. You don't control me anymore, Sarah said. You don't get to lie, cheat and steal and expect me to stay silent. I'm done being your victim. As James sat in stunned silence, Emily felt a wave of pride and relief. For the first time in years, Sarah was taking back her power, and while the road ahead would be filled with challenges, they both knew one thing for certain: James's lies were no longer their burden to carry. The confrontation left James reeling, but it gave Sarah and Emily the clarity they needed. That night, Sarah made a decision that had been a long time coming. She called Emily into the kitchen and sat her down. I can't live like this anymore, she said. I've spent too many years sacrificing my happiness for the sake of this family, and look where it's gotten us. Emily nodded, her eyes filled with empathy. What are you going to do, Mum? I'm going to leave him, Sarah said firmly, her voice steady despite the tears pooling in her eyes. I've stayed silent for too long, but I won't let him take anything more from me. It's time I put myself first. For Emily, the words were both heartbreaking and empowering. She knew how deeply her mother had loved James, how much she had invested in their life together. But she also knew that staying would only mean more pain. The next morning, Sarah began making arrangements. She called a lawyer and explained the situation, detailing not only James's affair, but also his financial misdeeds. The lawyer assured her that she had a strong case and could protect her share of their assets. It wasn't just about money. It was about ensuring that James's betrayal didn't leave her completely powerless. James, meanwhile, was a shadow of his former self. The confidence and charm he once exuded had been replaced by a nervous, apologetic man trying desperately to salvage what was left of his family. But Sarah wasn't interested in his apologies anymore. "You've said enough," she told him one evening when he tried to plead his case. "Now it's time for me to say something, for the first time in years." She told him she wanted a divorce. The words hung in the air like a final blow, and for a moment James looked like he might collapse. But Sarah didn't waver. She had spent years living for someone else, and now she was finally taking control of her life. The weeks that followed were a whirlwind of change. Sarah moved into a small but cozy apartment, leaving the house she had shared with James behind. It wasn't easy. Every corner of that house was filled with memories, both good and bad. But as she unpacked boxes and arranged furniture in her new space, Sarah felt something she hadn't felt in years: freedom. Emily stood by her mother every step of the way. She helped Sarah navigate the legal process, attended meetings with the lawyer, and offered a shoulder to lean on during the difficult moments. Their bond grew stronger through the ordeal, and for the first time, Sarah felt like she had a true partner in Emily. As for James, he was left to face the consequences of his actions. The financial investigation revealed that he had been embezzling funds from his business to support his double life, and legal action was taken against him. His fall from grace was swift and unforgiving, and the man who had once seemed untouchable was now a pariah in the very community that had admired him. But for Sarah, this wasn't about revenge. It was about reclaiming her life. She enrolled in a few classes at the local community center, something she had always wanted to do but never had the time or confidence for. She reconnected with old friends and even began exploring new hobbies like painting and gardening. Emily watched with pride as her mother blossomed into a new version of herself, stronger, more independent, and more at peace. One evening, as they sat together in Sarah's apartment, Emily said, "I'm so proud of you, Mum. You've been through so much, but you came out of it stronger." Sarah smiled, tears glistening in her eyes. "I couldn't have done it without you," she said. "You gave me the strength to face the truth. And now, for the first time in a long time, I feel like I'm finally living for myself." The journey had been painful, filled with betrayal, heartbreak, and difficult decisions. But in the end, Sarah and Emily found something far more valuable than the life they had lost. They found each other and a future filled with hope. As they sat together, laughing over cups of tea, the weight of the past began to lift. The betrayal that had once defined their lives was now just a chapter in their story, a story of resilience, strength, and the unbreakable bond between a mother and daughter. Months passed, and life began to take on a new rhythm for Sarah and Emily. The wounds James had inflicted were still there, but they were no longer raw. Slowly the pain started to fade, replaced by a sense of resilience that neither of them had expected. Sarah's new life wasn't grand or extravagant, but it was hers. Every choice she made, every small victory she achieved, was a reminder that she had taken back control of her story. Emily, too, found a sense of purpose in supporting her mother. Watching Sarah rebuild her life taught Emily lessons about strength, forgiveness, and the value of facing difficult truths. Their bond had deepened in ways neither of them could have imagined, and they both realized that what they had now was far more important than what they had lost. James's absence was felt, but not missed. The man who had once been the center of their family was now a distant memory, a cautionary tale about the dangers of betrayal and deceit. He had reached out a few times, sending messages filled with apologies and attempts to explain himself, but Sarah never responded. She had moved on, and she had no intention of looking back. One sunny afternoon, Sarah and Emily sat together in a park near Sarah's apartment, watching children play and couples walk hand in hand. Emily turned to her mother and asked, "Do you ever regret it? Leaving him, I mean." Sarah thought for a moment, then shook her head. "No," she said softly. "The only thing I regret is not leaving sooner. I spent so many years trying to hold on to something that wasn't real, but now I finally feel free." Emily smiled, her heart swelling with pride. "You deserve this, Mum. You deserve to be happy." Sarah reached over and took Emily's hand. "So do you," she said. "And if there's one thing I've learned through all of this, it's that happiness doesn't come from someone else. It comes from knowing who you are and refusing to settle for less than you deserve." As they sat there, the weight of the past seemed to melt away. The betrayal that had once consumed their lives was now just a part of their story, a chapter they had closed. What remained was a bond stronger than ever, and a future that was theirs to shape. For Sarah and Emily, the journey hadn't been easy, but it had been worth it. They had faced the darkest parts of their lives and come out stronger. And as the sun set over the park that day, they knew one thing for certain: the betrayal hadn't destroyed them. It had freed them to start again.